The stagecoach pulled into Salvation Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a Tuesday in April of 1882, and Alma Abbott stepped off it with $30 folded inside her left boot, a battered traveling case in her right hand, and a letter of introduction that she had already learned in 3 towns running that no one was going to believe. The letter was real. She had watched Dr. Emmett Hale write it himself at his desk in Cincinnati, had watched him press his seal into the wax and hand it to her with both solemn hands as though it were a document of considerable importance, which in her mind it was. Dr. Hale had trained her for 2 full years in practical nursing and medicinal preparation. He had taught her how to set a bone, how to clean a wound before infection took hold, how to read the color of a man's skin, and know what it was telling her before the man himself had any idea. He had written that all of this was true inside the letter, and he had told her that the frontier territories were in desperate need of trained medical workers, that a woman of her competence could build a life and a practice somewhere out west, where people were not particular about credentials so long as a person could do the work. What doctor? Hale had not accounted for, because he was a kind and optimistic man who had spent most of his life in the orderly world of a Cincinnati medical college, was the particular way in which men in the frontier towns looked at a 24-year-old woman traveling alone with a nursing letter and no husband and no family connection, and decided, without troubling themselves to read past the first line, that she was either confused or dishonest or both. In Tucson, the land agent had laughed. In Albuquerque, the territorial medical officer had been polite enough to read the whole thing before explaining to her, in the tone a man uses when he is trying to sound reasonable while being deeply unreasonable, that the territory did not recognize the credentials of a woman in a medical capacity, and that she might find work as a domestic. In a small town called Redrock that she had passed through on the stage, the sheriff had not even taken the letter out of her hands. He had simply looked at her and said that whatever she was selling, he had no use for it and had walked away. So Alma Abbott stepped off the stage in Salvation Creek, already knowing the shape of what was coming, and she stood in the April dust with her traveling case and her $30 and her letter, and she looked up at the main street of a town that was neither particularly impressive nor particularly welcoming, and she thought simply that she had not come this far to go back. The town was alive in the loose, unpredictable way that frontier towns in the New Mexico Territory were alive in 1882. There was a dry goods store and a saloon and a livery and a building that advertised itself as the Salvation Creek Hotel in faded painted letters over the door. There was a blacksmith whose hammer rang out at regular intervals like a slow heartbeat. There were horses tied at rails and men moving between buildings with the purposeful, dust-covered energy of people who had too much to do and not enough daylight to do it in. There were 2 women crossing the far end of the street together, both wearing practical bonnets, neither of them looking her direction. What Salvation Creek did not appear to have was a doctor. That was what she had been told by the stage driver, a leathery old man named Crookshank who had warmed to her somewhere around the 2nd hour of the journey, because she had, without being asked, helped him get a splinter out of the back of his hand, using a needle she kept in her traveling case. He had told her that Salvation Creek's last doctor had died of fever the previous autumn, and that the town had been making do ever since with a woman named Mrs. Dyer who knew herbs but was not particularly scientific about it, and with whoever was willing to try their hand when someone got shot or broke something. This was the most promising news Alma had received in 3 weeks of traveling. She made her way to the hotel first because her legs were stiff from the stage and her mouth was dry, and she needed to put her traveling case somewhere before she could do anything sensible. The hotel lobby was dim and smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. The man behind the front desk had a wide, flat face and suspicious eyes, and he looked at her the way all of them looked at her, with that particular Western masculine calculation that was measuring not her competence but her audacity in existing without a male connection to vouch for her presence. She asked for a room for the week and paid him from the money in her boot, and he gave her a key without saying anything warm, and she carried her case up a narrow staircase to a room that was small and clean enough, and had a window that looked out over the back of the building toward a stretch of open land and the beginning of the mountains beyond. She sat on the edge of the bed and took the letter out of her coat pocket and read it again, as she had read it many times on this journey, not because she needed to remember what it said, but because she needed to remember that it was true. Then she folded it back up, tucked it into her pocket, and went downstairs to find out where a person asked about work in a town like this. The man at the hotel desk told her to try the general store, because the owner knew everyone, and the owner of the general store, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Calder, told her that if she was looking for work in any kind of medical way, she ought to speak to the town council, and that the town council met on Thursday evenings at the saloon, which was where town council meetings happened in Salvation Creek, because the town did not yet have a proper meeting hall. It was Tuesday. Thursday was 2 days away. Alma thanked Mrs. Calder and bought a small amount of dried goods she needed, and stepped back out onto the main street, and stood in the afternoon sun trying to think about how best to use the intervening time. That was when she heard the commotion from the direction of the livery. It was not a dangerous commotion. It was more of a strained, frustrated one. The sound of something that was not going right combined with the sound of a man's voice that was low and direct, and not panicked, but very clearly concerned. She walked toward it because walking toward a commotion rather than away from it was the habit she had built in 2 years of training, and she came around the side of the livery to find a man crouched in the dirt beside a horse that was lying on its side, and the horse was clearly in distress, and the man was clearly trying to figure out what to do about it. She noticed the man first the way you notice the frame before you notice the painting, broad-shouldered, dark hair pushed back from his face under a dusty hat, jaw set tight with concentration, hands moving over the horse's neck with practiced care. He was maybe 28 or 30, she could not be precisely sure, and he was wearing the clothes of a working rancher, nothing fancy, just worn leather and sturdy cotton and boots that had seen considerable miles. She noticed the horse second, and the horse was more immediately relevant because it was showing the signs that she recognized. "It is colic," she said, coming toward them with her case already open. The man looked up at her with the quick, measuring look of someone who has been surprised, but is not reckless enough to dismiss anything useful. He had dark eyes, steady and direct, and there was something in the steadiness of them that was different from the studied dismissiveness she had been encountering for 3 weeks. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they are genuinely seeing. "You know horses," he said. "I know medicine," she said. "The principles are not entirely different. What has she eaten today?" he told her. She asked 2 more questions, both quick and specific, and he answered both of them without questioning why she was asking, which she noted with some appreciation. And by the time she had her hands on the horse's abdomen, she had a reasonable picture of what was happening. "She needs to move," Alma said. "Can you get her up?" "Been trying." "Try again. I will help." It took them 10 minutes of patient, careful work, the man coaxing the horse with hands and voice, Alma applying what pressure she could and talking steadily in the low, even tone that she had learned animals responded to almost as readily as people. The horse came up finally, unsteady and unhappy, and they walked her slowly back and forth in the space behind the livery, while the afternoon sun dropped toward the mountains. "She needs to keep moving for at least an hour," Alma said. "Walking will help pass the gas that is causing the pain. She should not eat until tomorrow, and even then start with very little. I have some peppermint oil in my case that you can rub along her belly if the distress continues, but I think if you keep her moving she will come right." The man was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not skeptical, it was more like someone recalculating something. "You come in on the stage today," he said. "I did. You a nurse?" "A trained one, yes, from Cincinnati." "I have a letter of introduction from my instructor, Dr. Emmett Hale, if you would like to see it." She said the last part with a particular flatness in her voice that she had not intended to be there, but it came out anyway, the flatness of someone who has offered a thing 3 times and had it refused. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "I do not need to see it. What I just watched you do tells me more than a letter would." Alma Abbott stood in the dusty space behind the livery of Salvation Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the late afternoon light of April 1882, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had been holding very carefully rigid for 3 weeks. It was not a dramatic shift. It was more like the slight release of a tension you have been carrying so long you had forgotten it was there. "You are kind to say so," she said. "I am practical to say so," he said, and something in the way he said it, with a corner of his mouth moving just slightly, made it clear that this was not a cold statement but something warmer underneath. He extended his hand. "Henry Dalton. I run the Dalton Ranch about 4 miles north of town." "Alma Abbott," she said, and took his hand, and it was a firm, warm handshake, the kind that meant something. They walked the horse for the full hour. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Henry Dalton was a man who was comfortable not talking, which Alma found immediately restful after 3 weeks of either defending herself or navigating around men who used words as obstacles. When he did talk, it was to ask her questions that were genuinely curious, not challenging, and she found herself answering them more fully than she had answered anyone in a long time. She told him about Cincinnati and Dr. Hale and the 2 years of training. She told him about the growing conviction that the frontier was where she could actually do something useful with what she had learned, that the established eastern cities were already supplied with proper physicians, and that a woman trained but not credentialed was always going to be on the margins there, but that out here there was genuine need. She did not tell him about the 3 towns that had rejected her because she did not want to sound like someone asking for sympathy. But he asked, with the directness of someone who had already understood more than she had said, whether she had found the territory welcoming. "Not particularly," she said. He nodded like he had expected that answer, and it made him quietly angry in a way he was not going to perform for her benefit. "The territory is in need," he said. "Doc Reeves' dying last fall left a hole that nobody has been able to fill. Closest proper physician is in Santa Fe, and that is half a day's hard ride in good weather. Mrs. Dyer does her best, but her best does not cover everything." "I heard," Alma said. "I'm hoping to speak to the town council Thursday." Henry was quiet for a moment, leading the horse in a slow loop. "I am on the town council," he said. The stillness that fell between them after that was different from the previous quiet. It was fuller somehow. "Is that so?" Alma said. "It is," he said. "And for what it is worth, if you come Thursday, I will vouch for you." She looked at him then, really looked at him in the fading afternoon light, this man who had known her for slightly over an hour and had watched her diagnose his horse and had decided in the clean, practical way of someone who trusted their own judgment that she was exactly what she said she was. "You have not even read my letter," she said. "No," he agreed. "I have watched you work." "That is more reliable. Most people want the letter. Most people," he said, "are more interested in the appearance of authority than in the presence of it." Alma looked back at the horse, who was moving more easily now, the distress gradually easing from her gait, and she thought that Dr. Emmett Hale had been right about the frontier, just not in quite the way he had imagined. He had told her the frontier did not care about credentials. He had been slightly wrong about that. What he should have said was that the frontier contained both of the extremes, people who would dismiss her faster than anyone back east, and people who would see her more clearly than anyone back east ever had. The ratio of the two was not reassuring. But Henry Dalton was definitively in the second category, and he was on the town council, and the horse was doing better, and it was only Tuesday. She let herself feel something close to hope. Henry walked her back to the main street when the hour was done, the horse now standing steady and much improved in the livery behind them. He carried her case without asking whether she wanted him to, which she found she did not mind, and he walked beside her with a natural ease, not crowding her, not performing anything. At the entrance to the hotel, he handed her case back to her and touched the brim of his hat. "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock at the saloon," he said. "I will make sure there is time on the agenda for you to present." "I am grateful," she said. "Come prepared," he said. "Gus Hartley is on the council and he will push back on anything he did not think of first. Do not let him rattle you." "I do not rattle easily," she said. Something crossed his face then, something that was plainly appreciative and plainly honest. "No," he said. "I can see that." He tipped his hat and walked back down the street toward the livery, and Alma went upstairs to her small room and sat at the window in the last of the light and took out her letter of introduction and read it once more. But this time she was not reading it to remind herself it was true. She was already past that. She was thinking about Thursday. The 2 days between Tuesday and Thursday passed with the particular texture of days in which you are trying to appear patient while being nothing of the kind. Alma spent them usefully. She introduced herself to Mrs. Dyer, the herb woman, a compact and unexpectedly warm woman in her 50s who wore her gray hair in a long practical braid and had a small house on the edge of town that smelled magnificently of dried plants. Mrs. Dyer looked at her with open, frank curiosity rather than suspicion, and when Alma explained what she knew and where she had trained, Mrs. Dyer asked her a series of very specific questions about poultices and fever treatments that Alma answered with the confidence of someone who had done the work and not just read about it. At the end of the conversation, Mrs. Dyer said, "Well, you know more than I do about most of the hard cases, and what I know about plants I can share, and between the two of us this town might actually stop losing people unnecessarily." She said it matter-of-factly, without ceremony, and Alma felt a warmth for this woman that was immediate and genuine. She also spent part of Wednesday morning sitting at a corner table in the hotel dining room, writing out a careful presentation of her qualifications and her proposed arrangement. She knew that she needed to be precise and practical rather than emotional, that the way to move men like Gus Hartley was through the logic of necessity rather than any appeal to fairness, though fairness was certainly also relevant. She drafted it twice and read it back to herself in a low voice, and adjusted the parts that sounded uncertain until they sounded like what she actually was, which was a trained and competent person who was proposing a reasonable arrangement in a place that badly needed what she had. Henry Dalton came into the hotel dining room on Wednesday afternoon, and she was still at her corner table with her papers spread around her, and he stopped at the door when he saw her and then came in, turning his hat in his hands in the way men did when they were weighing whether they were intruding. "I was hoping to find you here," he said. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair across from her, and he sat, his hat on the table between them. "I wanted to let you know that I spoke to Mayor Ferris this morning," he said. "He is open to the idea. He has been worried about the medical situation since Doc Reeves died. His wife had a difficult time over winter with a persistent chest ailment, and there was nothing to be done except wait it out, which was hard on everyone." "Is she recovered?" Alma asked. "She is mostly, but it was the kind of thing that would have been better managed with proper medical attention, and he knows it." Henry paused, and there was something careful in what he said next. "Gus Hartley is going to be the difficulty. He has opinions about what is and is not appropriate for women." "What is his particular objection likely to be?" Henry considered this with the focused seriousness of someone who knew Gus Hartley well and was not going to minimize the problem for the sake of reassuring her. "He will say that a woman treating men is improper. He will say that without a formal physician's license the town could be held liable. He will probably make some comment about your age." "He would be wrong on all 3 counts," Alma said calmly. "He would be," Henry agreed. "But he will say them anyway, and he has the ear of 2 other council members who tend to follow his lead. And you have the ear of the others. I do, and so does the mayor when he chooses to use it. He looked at her across the table with the same steady directness he had looked at her with behind the livery, and there was something in his eyes that was not just strategic discussion. I want you to know that I will argue your case as strongly as I am able. I am not making you a promise I cannot keep, but I will not be quiet about it. Alma looked at him for a long moment. This man who had known her for barely more than a day was sitting across a table from her in a frontier hotel in New Mexico territory, offering to stand between her and a man she had not met yet, not because he wanted anything from her, as far as she could tell, but because he had watched her help his horse and made a judgment and intended to act on it. "Why?" she said. He seemed to think the question deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat brim. "Because this town needs someone who can do what you can do," he said. "And because what happened to Doc Reeves, dying of fever with nobody to treat him properly, is not something I want to see repeated for a lack of being willing to recognize competence when it is right in front of me." It was a complete and honest answer, and she received it as such. But she also noticed that his gaze did not move from her face when he said it, and that there was something in the quality of his attention that was not entirely accounted for by practicality and town welfare. She noticed this the way she noticed useful information, quietly, without reacting to it immediately, filing it for later consideration. "I appreciate your support," she said. "And I will be ready Thursday evening." He nodded, and there was a small, warm pause that neither of them filled with anything unnecessary, and then he put his hat back on and stood and said good evening and left, and Alma sat for a moment looking at the door he had gone out of before she turned back to her papers. Thursday evening arrived wearing the last colors of a desert sunset, all copper and violet over the mountains to the west, and Alma walked to the saloon with her letter in her coat pocket and her presentation organized in her mind, and the particular stillness that she could always find in herself before something important, the stillness that was not fearlessness but was better than fearlessness, because it was chosen rather than accidental. The saloon was the largest interior space in Salvation Creek, a wide room with scarred wooden floors and a bar along one side, and tables pushed together in the center to form a meeting arrangement. There were 6 men at the council table, and about a dozen townspeople arranged in chairs and along the wall as observers, which she had not quite expected but which she absorbed without flinching. Henry Dalton was at the table, and he saw her come in and gave her a single nod that was brief and steady, and meant everything it needed to mean. Mayor Ferris was a round-faced, earnest man who looked like he had been worrying about something for approximately the last 6 months, and was hopeful that this meeting might address it. He welcomed her with genuine warmth and introduced her to the council, and when he got to Gus Hartley, Hartley looked at her with the particular flat hostility of a man who has already decided and does not intend to be persuaded. Alma stood at the end of the table and presented her case with the precision of someone who has been turned away 3 times and has refined their argument accordingly. She told them about her training. She told them about the specific cases she had handled under Dr. Hale's supervision. She told them, in plain and deliberate language, about the practical realities of frontier medical care, about the kinds of injuries and illnesses that were most common in a ranching and mining community, and about what the difference was between having trained medical attention and not having it. She quoted figures from territorial health records that Dr. Hale had given her, about infection rates and survival outcomes, because she knew that Gus Hartley was not going to be moved by anything except the kind of hard practical argument that made it difficult for him to say no without looking irresponsible in front of his neighbors. She finished by laying her letter of introduction on the table. She did not insist that anyone read it. She simply placed it there and said that it was available to anyone who wished to examine Dr. Hale's credentials and his assessment of her abilities, and that she was equally happy to demonstrate those abilities directly if the council wished to arrange some kind of practical assessment. There was a silence when she finished. Then Gus Hartley said, as Henry had predicted, that a woman treating men was improper, and that without a formal license the town could be held liable, and then he looked at her and said that she seemed very young for all of this. Alma had prepared for all three objections. She addressed the first by pointing out, with specific territorial examples, that women had been providing frontier medical care throughout the New Mexico territory for decades, and that the territory had never legislated against it. She addressed the second by explaining that she was proposing to operate under the formal oversight of Mayor Ferris and the council, documented and recorded, which would constitute a reasonable liability shield. She addressed the third by pointing out, with a directness that brought a sound from the wall of observers that might have been suppressed laughter, that Doc Reeves had been 26 when he came to Salvation Creek, and that to her knowledge his age had not been raised as a concern. Henry Dalton said, from his seat at the table, in the level and certain voice of a man who has made up his mind and is not interested in reversing it, "I have seen this woman work. I have seen her diagnose and treat accurately and with skill. This town has been without proper medical care since October, and we have been fortunate that it has not cost us more than it has. I move that we accept Miss Abbott's proposal on a trial period of 6 months, at the end of which the council reviews and makes a permanent determination." Mayor Ferris seconded it immediately, and when the vote was taken it was 4-2, Gus Hartley and one other man dissenting. Alma said thank you to the room with the composure of someone who was not going to let them see how much this meant, and when she turned from the table Henry Dalton was there, not quite beside her but near enough, and the expression on his face was one she did not think he often let people see, openly pleased, openly warm, like something had been settled that he had wanted settled. "Well done," he said, quietly enough that it was for her and not for the room. "Thank you for what you said," she told him. "I said what was true," he answered. They walked out of the saloon together into the cool desert evening, and for a moment they stood on the boardwalk while the last of the copper light left the sky, and Henry Dalton said, $30 and a letter, you really did come out here on not very much." She had mentioned the $30 at the table, as part of making the council understand she was proposing a formal paid arrangement rather than charity work. She had not expected him to have held onto that detail. "It is enough to start," she said. He looked at her, and in the near dark of the evening his eyes were steady and warm, and there was something in his expression that she had been filing away since Tuesday afternoon, and was now finding she could no longer continue to file with clinical detachment, because it was looking at her too directly and too honestly. "It is enough for two people to start, if they are sensible about it," he said. The words were careful and they were clear, and they hung in the April night air with a precision that left very little room for misinterpretation. "Henry Dalton," she said, and she heard in her own voice something she recognized as being honest in return, "I have known you for 2.5 days. "I know," he said. "I am not proposing anything tonight except that you might be willing to let me show you the territory, the parts of it that are good, which there are many." She looked at him for a long moment. The mountains were dark shapes against the lesser dark of the sky. The town was settling into its evening sounds, horses and voices and the distant ring of the blacksmith finally gone quiet. "I would find that agreeable," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it was a very good thing to see. "Saturday morning, then," he said. "I will come by the hotel at 8. She said good night and went inside and up to her room, and she sat at the window in the dark for a while without lighting the lamp, looking at the mountains and thinking about the 3 weeks of closed doors, and the letter that nobody had believed, and the $30 still mostly intact in her boot. And how improbable it was that any of this had led here, to a small room above a frontier hotel with a vote in her favor, and a man who had said that $30 was enough for both of them to start. She did not let herself rush ahead into planning. She was a practical woman. but she did let herself feel the warmth of it, sitting in the dark with the desert quiet around her, and it was a very good kind of warmth. In the weeks that followed, Alma Abbott became what Salvation Creek needed her to be with a speed that surprised even herself, though it should not have. Need was a powerful catalyst. Mrs. Dyer gave her the use of the front room of her house, which was larger and more central than anywhere else available, and the two women set it up as a proper treatment room together. Alma's medical knowledge and Mrs. Dyer's plant remedies combining into something more complete than either had managed alone. The first week brought 3 cases. A ranch hand with a badly infected laceration on his forearm that had been improperly closed and was already showing the signs of serious infection. A woman whose child was running a high fever that had persisted for 4 days. An elderly man named Mr. Treadwell, who had been managing a broken finger himself with a crooked homemade splint that was healing wrong. She cleaned and properly closed the ranch hand's wound and gave him clear instructions about keeping it clean and changing the dressing. And she told him directly that if he had waited another week, it would have meant losing the arm or worse. He was a young man of about 22 named Billy Crane, and he looked at her with the wide-eyed, half-convinced expression of someone who had not quite expected this to be a real medical interaction, and was being rapidly convinced otherwise. She brought the fever down in the child over the course of 2 anxious days, sitting with the mother through the worst of the second night, and monitoring the child's temperature with the careful, steady attention of someone who understood that in cases like these the quality of attention was often the most important medicine. The child's name was Thomas, and he was 4 years old, and when the fever broke in the early hours of the 3rd morning, and he opened his eyes and asked for water in a thin, clear voice, his mother made a sound that was beyond words. She reset Mr. Treadwell's finger with the calm, expert efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to know exactly how to minimize the pain while maximizing the result. And Mr. Treadwell, who was 71 and had the dusty dignity of a man who had been on the frontier since before it was a territory, told her afterward that she had good hands, and that was the finest compliment a doctor ever got. She told him that she was not a doctor, and he said that was a matter of paperwork and not reality, and that he intended to tell everyone he knew, which as one of the oldest men in the area was a considerable number of people. Word moved through Salvation Creek and the surrounding ranches the way words moved through all frontier communities, which was fast and thorough. By the end of the 2nd week, people were coming to see her from as far as 8 miles out, ranching families and miners and the occasional traveler, and she was managing a caseload that would have been respectable for a fully licensed physician in a larger town. Gus Hartley pointedly did not come to her, and when he needed a tooth drawn, he rode to Santa Fe for it, which Salvation Creek found quietly hilarious because the round trip was the better part of 2 days, and the Santa Fe dentist had a well-known reputation for rough work. But Gus had principles, if you could call them that. Henry came to see her on the Saturday he had promised, and the morning began as a practical tour of the territory on horseback, and became something else by early afternoon, which was how she would remember it afterward, the exact point at which it shifted from a courteous neighborly gesture to something both of them were paying very close attention to. He rode well, which she expected, but there was more to how he moved through this landscape than mere competence. He moved through it as though he belonged to it, as though the particular quality of the morning light over the mesa and the smell of the dry sage, and the way the mountains looked closer than they were was all personally familiar to him, was home in a way that went all the way down to the bone. He had grown up in this territory, he told her as they rode north toward his ranch. His father had come out from Missouri in the early 1860s when Henry was just a boy, had bought land and built a cattle operation from essentially nothing, had died of a heart attack 8 years ago, leaving Henry the ranch and an older sister named Clara, who now lived in Albuquerque with her husband and wrote regularly. His mother had died when Henry was 16. It was a history that contained significant loss, told in the measured, unsentimental way of a man who had made his peace with it without pretending it had been easy. "Do you ever think about going somewhere else?" she asked him. "No," he said, and the simplicity of it was absolute. "This is where I am supposed to be." I knew that by the time I was 12, and I have never had occasion to doubt it. He looked over at her with a slight sideways attention. "Do you think about going back to Cincinnati?" "No," she said, and was surprised to discover that the simplicity of her answer matched his. He smiled at the road ahead, a small private smile, and she noticed it. The ranch was beautiful in the way working places can be beautiful, not ornamented or arranged for prettiness, but honest in its structure. The buildings sitting low and solid against the landscape as though they had grown there. The cattle visible in the middle distance, the whole thing breathing with purpose and use. He showed her around with a pride that was modest but real, and she asked questions that were genuinely curious, because she had not grown up around any of this, and everything was interesting to her. They ate lunch on the porch of the main house, bread and cold meat and coffee, and they talked for longer than the meal required, and the conversation moved through things easily and naturally. His opinions on territorial politics and the railroad and the treatment of the Apache, about which he had views that were more nuanced and less flatly dismissive than most of what she had heard on the subject. And her opinions on medical education and the particular barriers that women faced in establishing professional credibility, about which he listened with a focused attention that made it clear he was actually considering what she was saying rather than waiting to respond. When the afternoon moved toward 3 o'clock and they were back on the horses heading toward town, Alma said, somewhat obliquely and without looking directly at him, "This has been a very pleasant day." "It has," he said. "I do not know the last time I had one quite like it." "Neither do I," he said, and there was a weight to it that she did not miss. They rode the rest of the way to town in a silence that was full of something neither of them was quite ready to name directly yet. And when he left her at the hotel and rode back, she stood for a moment on the boardwalk watching him go and thought that she was going to have to be very careful here, not because she was afraid of what she felt, but because she wanted to be sure of it before she let it be visible. And because Henry Dalton struck her as a man who would rather have one honest thing than a dozen cautious ones. The weeks became a month, and the month began to move toward summer. Alma's medical practice settled into its rhythms, and Mrs. Dyer became something that occupied the interesting territory between mentor and close friend. A woman who had been alone for 20 years since her husband had been killed in a mining accident, and who received Alma's presence in her house and life with the quiet gladness of someone who had been doing without company, without knowing how much they had missed it. Henry Dalton came to town 3 or 4 times a week, more often than his ranch business strictly required, and this did not go unnoticed by anyone in Salvation Creek, including Alma herself. He found reasons, supplies to collect, council matters to attend to, a conversation with the blacksmith that never seemed to take as long as he had perhaps intended it to. He found ways to be near the treatment room at reasonable hours, and there were lunches at the hotel dining room and evening walks along the edge of town, where the desert opened up, and the sky went on forever, and long conversations that covered the distance between two people who were becoming more honest with each other by increments. He told her about loneliness, one evening in June, not in those exact words but in a roundabout and honest way, describing the particular quality of the ranch in winter when the work slowed, and the evenings were very long and Clara was in Albuquerque, and there were no neighbors close enough for casual company. He said it as a simple fact rather than a bid for sympathy, and she received it as such. She told him, the same evening, about the loss of her parents 4 years ago, fever taking both of them in the same terrible month, and about how it had galvanized her decision to pursue medical training rather than the domestic future that had been somewhat assumed for her. She told him about the first time she had helped save a life under Dr. Hale's direction, and the particular fierce, clear joy of it, the sense of being exactly in the place where she was meant to be and doing exactly the thing she was meant to do. He listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who understood that certain things needed to be received properly, and when she finished he said, "You are extraordinary," in a tone so direct and unceremonious that it landed completely differently than a compliment usually did. She looked at him in the fading light. The desert was cooling around them in the gradual way it always did in the evenings, releasing the heat of the day and replacing it with something sweet and dry. The stars were beginning. "I am just doing what I was trained to do," she said. "No," he said. "You came here with $30 and a letter nobody would believe, and you have built something real in 2 months. That is not just training. That is character." He paused, and then with the careful honesty of a man who has been working up to something for approximately 8 weeks he said, "I find myself thinking about you constantly, Alma. I want you to know that. I am not trying to pressure you toward anything. I just think you should know what is true." The sound of her name in his voice, not Miss Abbott, just Alma, said with that plainness and that warmth, was something she felt all the way through her. "I think about you too," she said. "I have been trying to be measured about it." "You do not have to be," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I have just been out of practice with trusting things." He moved toward her slightly on the bench where they were sitting, not dramatically, just the small deliberate movement of closing the distance between two people, and she let it happen, and then she was close enough to him to feel the warmth of his presence in the cooling evening air, and she thought that this was the most natural thing she had felt in a very long time. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your consent." "You have it," she said. He took her hand then, carefully, and held it, and they sat in the darkening evening, while the stars came out one by one over the New Mexico territory, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. The summer of 1882 was long and hot and full. Alma's practice grew into something that the town of Salvation Creek had genuinely come to rely on. She handled a complicated childbirth in July that Mrs. Dyer assisted with, a first-time mother whose labor had gone long and difficult, and she kept both mother and child through what might otherwise have been a tragedy. And the father, a young rancher named Will Stocker, stood afterward in the doorway of the treatment room with tears running unchecked down his weathered face, and said that if there was anything on his property or in his person that she ever needed, she had only to say the word. She handled a mining accident in late July that brought 3 men in from the hills, 2 with serious injuries and 1 with a broken collarbone. She worked for 6 straight hours, Mrs. Dyer beside her passing instruments and mixing what she needed, and all 3 men came through, which generated a kind of word of mouth that no formal credential could have purchased. Even Gus Hartley, who had been maintaining his principled objection with the stubbornness of a man who does not know how to retreat gracefully, appeared at the treatment room door one afternoon in early August with a badly sprained wrist that he said he had managed to acquire falling off his porch. Alma treated it without commentary, wrapped it properly, told him what to do to manage the pain and how long it would take to heal, and charged him the same modest fee she charged everyone. He stood at the door when he was leaving with a complicated expression on his face, and finally said, gruffly and without looking at her directly, "You appear to know what you are doing." "I do," she said. He made a sound that was not quite an apology but was in the neighborhood of one, and left, and Mrs. Dyer, who had been in the back room and came out with her eyes bright, said that she believed that was as close to being proved right as either of them was going to get from Gus Hartley in this lifetime, which was close enough to satisfying. Henry came to dinner every Sunday when his ranch business permitted, which was most Sundays. He came to the treatment room when she had difficult cases, not to help with the medicine, that was her domain, and he respected it completely, but to be present, to bring food when she had not eaten, to sit in the front room and read or do paperwork while she worked late, so that she was not alone in the small hours. It was the kind of steady, practical affection that she recognized as more revealing of character than any grand gesture would have been, and she loved him for it with a warmth that was growing deeper by the week. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and enough comfort with each other to say what they thought. They argued about territorial politics and about the railroad, and once about whether Mrs. Calder at the general store was being unreasonable about her pricing, which was a minor argument that dissolved in laughter approximately 4 minutes in. They argued with the ease of two people who trusted each other enough not to be afraid of disagreement, and the arguments always resolved not because one of them capitulated, but because they were genuinely interested in each other's thinking. She told him once, sitting on his porch in the late evening with a sky full of stars, that she had been afraid when she left Cincinnati that she was making a decision that could not be unmade, and that the fear had been not of the frontier exactly but of arriving somewhere and finding nothing to hold onto. "And now," he said, "now I have everything to hold onto," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side with the easy certainty of something that has been true for a while and has simply been waiting for you to say it out loud. In September, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He was not a production-making man. They were riding back from a visit to the Stocker Ranch, where she had gone to check on the mother and baby who were both flourishing, and the evening was golden and the mountains were very clear, and he pulled his horse alongside hers and said, "Alma, I want to marry you. I think you are the best person I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you are glad you came to Salvation Creek." She looked at him in the golden evening light, this man who had believed her letter on sight and held her hand, while the stars came out and brought her food when she forgot to eat and argued with her about Mrs. Calder's prices, and watched her work with an admiration that was never patronizing and never qualified. This man who was as much a part of the landscape she had come to love as the mountains themselves. "Yes," she said, with such uncomplicated directness that he laughed, a full and delighted laugh, and reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way back to town with their hands linked and the evening pouring gold over everything. They were married in November, in the new meeting hall that the town had finally finished building in October, which struck everyone present as pleasingly appropriate, since the hall's completion had been partly motivated by the fact that Salvation Creek had grown enough over the past 2 years to need proper civic infrastructure. Reverend Pike, who came through the territory on a regular circuit and was a spare, dry, kind man who gave the impression of having seen everything and been moved by most of it, performed the ceremony with a warmth that made everyone in the room feel included. Mrs. Dyer was Alma's maid of honor, which Mrs. Dyer found entirely overwhelming in a way she managed, by being extremely practical about the dress and the flowers, and not allowing herself to be sentimental until the ceremony itself, at which point she cried without any attempt to conceal it. Will Stocker stood up for Henry, with the devoted loyalty of a man who feels he owes someone his entire world, and brought his wife and the baby, who was now 4 months old and named Henry, the baby. That is, in honor of the man his mother credited with making Alma's presence in Salvation Creek possible, which Henry Dalton received with a helpless, embarrassed pleasure. Even Gus Hartley came to the wedding and sat in the back, and did not object to anything, which everyone agreed was the most remarkable event of the whole autumn. Alma wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that Mrs. Dyer had pressed into perfection the night before, and she carried dried sage and late-blooming yellow flowers that grew along the creek, and when she walked up the aisle of the new meeting hall toward Henry Dalton, she felt the $30 that were no longer in her boot. They had long since been spent and replenished, and spent again in the ordinary course of building, A life felt them as a kind of ghost, a reminder of where this had started, and she thought that Dr. Emmett Hale had been right after all. Just not in the way either of them had imagined at the time. Henry was standing at the front of the room in a dark coat that she had not seen before, and his best boots, and his hair combed flat in a way that somehow made him look both more formal and more endearingly himself. And when he saw her, his whole face changed in the way it only changed for her, openly and completely, the composed and practical man giving way entirely to something unguarded and sure. The ceremony was brief because Reverend Pike was a man who understood that the important part of a wedding was not the length of the words but the truth behind them. And when he asked Henry if he took this woman, Henry said yes with the same clean certainty he brought to everything he believed. And when he asked Alma, she said yes in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the hall. They exchanged rings that Henry had had made by a silversmith who came through Albuquerque, simple and well made. And when the Reverend said they were married, Henry looked at her and she looked at him, and the whole gathered crowd of Salvation Creek made the sound of something going exactly right. The reception was held in the saloon because the new meeting hall did not yet have a proper kitchen, which meant it had gone full circle from the council meeting where all of this had effectively begun. And someone pointed this out, and it produced laughter. And there was food contributed by half the town and dancing because someone had brought a fiddle. And Alma danced with her husband in the rough, bright room surrounded by the people of the place that had become home. And thought that of all the things she had not known when she stepped off the stage in April, the thing she had most not known was this specific quality of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Henry danced, which surprised her slightly, because he was a man who did not generally do unnecessary things. He danced with the same focused competence he brought to everything, not showy but genuine, and he danced with her specifically like it was a thing he wanted to do and was glad to finally be doing. And when the music slowed, he held her closer and she put her head against his shoulder, and the saloon went on around them in the warm and happy way of a town, celebrating something it is genuinely glad about. They settled into married life with the same practical, affectionate ease with which they had settled into everything else. She kept her practice at Mrs. Dyer's house, which was now formally and officially contracted with the town council in a 6-month arrangement that had been renewed twice and was in the process of being made permanent. He ran the ranch. They had dinners and conversations and mornings that began early and evenings that ended late, and the whole texture of shared days that is the real substance of a life. In the spring of 1883, she told him they were going to have a child, and she told him on the porch of the ranch house in the morning light with the mountains sharp and clear on the horizon, and he was very still for a moment, and then he pulled her toward him carefully and held her with a tenderness that was different from anything she had felt from him before, deeper, more awed. "A boy or a girl," he said. "I do not know yet," she said. "I have a feeling it is a boy, but I have been wrong about that sort of thing before." He laughed against her hair. "Either one," he said. "Either one, and I will be the most grateful man in the territory." The boy was born in October of 1883, early on a Tuesday morning, which felt significant to Alma because Tuesday was the day she had arrived in Salvation Creek and the whole of it had begun. He was healthy and loud about it, and he had Henry's dark hair and something around the eyes that people kept saying was entirely his own. They named him James for Henry's father, with Emmett as a middle name for Dr. Hale, who received the letter informing him of this honor and wrote back from Cincinnati with a warmth that suggested he may have wept a little, though he would not have said so directly. Mrs. Dyer was present for the birth and delivered James with the steady, capable hands that Alma had come to trust entirely, and afterward sat in the front room of the ranch house with the baby in her arms, while Henry sat beside Alma and held her hand, and the morning light came through the windows. And it was the kind of moment that you know while it is happening, is one of the ones you will carry with you for the rest of your life. Little James was a strong and healthy baby who became a strong and lively boy with his mother's curiosity and his father's steadiness, which was a combination that kept both of them thoroughly occupied. He was interested in everything on the ranch and interested in the medical work, to the point that by the time he was 4 he had strong opinions about which plants were useful, gleaned from extensive time spent with Mrs. Dyer, who had appointed herself his honorary grandmother with a devotion that neither she nor anyone else pretended to understate. The letter from Dr. Emmett Hale continued to arrive every few months, full of news from Cincinnati and questions about the territory, and Alma wrote back in detail because she was aware that her situation was unusual in ways that might be useful to him in encouraging other students, particularly the women students who were beginning to appear in the medical programs with greater frequency, to consider the frontier territories as viable places to build a practice. She wrote to him once, in the winter of 1884, that she had learned something in Salvation Creek that no one had thought to tell her before she left Cincinnati, which was that the places that most need good work are not always the places that most readily welcome it, and that the letter of introduction and the $30 had been enough not because they constituted great resources, but because they had gotten her as far as the right person, and the right person had made everything else possible. Dr. Hale wrote back that this was the most valuable medical education report he had ever received from a former student, and that he intended to share it, with her permission. She gave her permission. The practice that she and Mrs. Dyer ran together expanded as the territory itself expanded, which it was doing vigorously in the middle 1880s, with the railroad pushing lines through and new settlements appearing, and the population of the New Mexico territory increasing steadily. There were more cases and more complex cases, and Alma wrote regularly to medical colleagues in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, building the network of consultation and referral that proper medical care required. She trained 2 young women from nearby ranching families who showed aptitude, teaching them the way Dr. Hale had taught her through direct experience and precise instruction combined, because she understood that the need for trained medical workers in the territory was not going to be adequately filled by waiting for formal institutions to catch up with the reality of the population. Mayor Ferris, who had backed her from the beginning, told her at a town council meeting in 1884 that the territory was going to need proper medical facilities, actual clinics, staffed and supplied, and that he intended to put Salvation Creek forward as a location for one of the first, and that he expected Alma Abbott Dalton to have considerable input into what that facility looked like. She did. Henry watched all of this with the steady, proud, unreserved pleasure of a man whose faith in someone has been entirely vindicated, not that he had needed the vindication to maintain the faith. He was a good ranch man and the ranch prospered, and he was on the town council and the town prospered, and he came home every evening to a house that was full of a life he had not quite known to imagine before it existed. In 1885, they had a daughter, born in August when the desert was at its warmest and the sunflowers were out along the creek. They named her Clara after Henry's sister, and Clara Dalton came into the world with a remarkable composure, and what Henry said looked like an immediate and thorough assessment of her surroundings, which made Alma laugh because she recognized it. James, who was nearly 2 years old, examined his sister with a seriousness that was entirely his father's, and then announced that she looked fine and went back to the wooden horse that was his current primary occupation. Clara Dalton grew up to inherit her mother's hands, which was what people called them in Salvation Creek, the hands that knew what to do. She also inherited her father's voice, low and certain, and between the two of them she was going to be something remarkable. Mrs. Dyer, who by 1885 was in her early 60s and had taken to needing her own herbal remedies for her joints more than she would have liked, continued to come to the treatment room 3 days a week, with the dedication of someone who has found their purpose and intends to honor it to the last. She and Alma moved through the room together with the ease of long practice, and the conversation between them had the comfortable depth of women who know each other's thoughts well enough not to need to explain everything. Henry and Alma had, as these years accumulated, the kind of marriage that becomes its own particular landscape, familiar and rich, and containing things that cannot be summarized from the outside. There were the ordinary frictions of shared living and the ordinary joys of it, the mornings over coffee and the Sunday dinners, and the long conversations that still managed to find new ground, and the nights when James had a nightmare and they both went, and the nights when the ranch had a problem, and she stayed awake with him while he worked through it, and the evenings on the porch with the stars coming out over the territory and the mountains on the horizon. He told her once, not particularly long after they were married, that he had not been looking for anything when she had come around the corner of the livery that Tuesday afternoon. He said he had been simply trying to get his horse upright and had been presented without warning with the clearest and most sensible person he had encountered in several years of trying to find the territory's chronic medical problem solvable. "It was the horse," she said. "It was you," he said. "The horse was incidental. The horse would disagree," she said. "The horse owes you a considerable debt," he said, "as do I." She had thought about the letter again, as she occasionally did, particularly on the days when she received new patients who had come from other towns because word of her practice had spread, or on the days when one of her trainees handled something difficult well. She thought about the 3 rejections and the flatness in her voice when she had offered the letter to Henry Dalton, and the way he had simply looked at her and said he did not need to see it, that he had watched her work. She had written to Dr. Hale about that moment specifically in one of her letters. She had told him that the most important thing in her professional life had been a man who looked at what she was doing rather than at the paper that described her, and that she thought this was perhaps what he had been trying to tell her when he encouraged her west. Not that the frontier did not care about documents, but that the frontier contained people who were practical enough to trust what they could see with their own eyes. Dr. Hale had written back that he had been trying to tell her something of the sort, and that she had put it considerably better than he had managed, and that he was going to use her exact words in his address to the next graduating class. She was glad of that. The years in Salvation Creek built into something that she could see clearly by the time she and Henry had been married 5 years, not because she was measuring it with any particular formality, but because the shape of it was unmistakable. The town had grown. The territory was changing, moving toward the order and infrastructure that would eventually make it a state, and the wild, contingent quality of frontier life was slowly giving way to something more settled, though it retained the openness and the particular quality of Western light that she had loved from her first afternoon. She had become, in ways that no letter of introduction could have predicted, not just the town's medical provider but one of its anchors, which was not something she had sought but had come to accept as part of what happened when you did your work honestly and well in a place for long enough. She knew everyone and was trusted by nearly everyone, including Gus Hartley, who had arrived at a grudging respect for her that he expressed by occasionally asking her opinion on things unrelated to medicine, which she took to be the sincerest form of concession available to a man of his particular constitution. Mrs. Dyer, who had become the nearest thing Alma had to a mother, passed away in the winter of 1886 peacefully, and in her own bed with Alma beside her and James and little Clara asleep in the next room, as they often were when they were at Mrs. Dyer's house. Alma held her hand through the last hours and spoke to her in the low, even tone that she had always known Mrs. Dyer found comforting, telling her about James's latest observation about plants and Clara's new and very determined interest in horses. And Mrs. Dyer had smiled at these stories in the last light way of someone very near the edge of sleeping, and then she had slept. The grief of it was the clean, real kind. The kind that comes when you have loved someone thoroughly and without reservation, and then they are gone. And Alma did not manage it with clinical detachment because that was not what it deserved. She wept, properly and completely, and Henry held her through the worst of it and did not try to make it less than it was, which was exactly right. She kept the treatment room at Mrs. Dyer's house, which had become in the community's understanding simply the medical house, and she tended the herb garden in the back with the care that Mrs. Dyer had tended it, because it was a living thing and useful, and because it was also a form of continuity that she felt she owed. She wrote to Dr. Hale after Mrs. Dyer died, telling him about her, and she said that the most important professional partnership of her career in Salvation Creek had been not with a physician but with an elderly woman who knew plants and was not particularly scientific about it, but who had known people and known this land, and that what she had learned from that partnership was that knowledge came in more forms than formal training recognized, which was something she intended to teach her own students carefully. Dr. Hale wrote that this was the wisest thing she had ever written him, and she thought he might be right. The new decade came, and the territory continued to change, and the Dalton Ranch continued to prosper under Henry's steady management, and the children grew. James at 7 was a serious, curious boy who had strong opinions about the cattle operation, and was learning to read medical books with a concentration that made Henry say, with a helpless affection, that they were going to have 2 doctors in the family, which Alma said was not the worst problem a family could have. Clara at 5 was a force entirely her own, possessed of a will and a cheerfulness that she deployed in combination with a devastating effectiveness, and a laugh that could be heard across the ranch yard. She had identified horses as her primary interest, and Henry had given her a small gentle mare named Biscuit with the solemn ceremony of someone making a serious gift, and Clara had received it with a gravity matching his, and then immediately broken into the laugh that carried everywhere. They rode together on Sunday morning still, Alma and Henry, the same way they had ridden that first Saturday when he had shown her the territory, except now the children sometimes came along, and the routes were familiar and beloved rather than new, and the mountains on the horizon were the mountains they knew. On one such Sunday morning in the autumn of 1887, riding along the ridge north of the ranch with the October light golden on everything and James on his pony ahead of them, and Clara on Biscuit beside Henry, Alma looked at all of it, the land and the light and this man beside her and these children that were the best part of both of them, and she felt the fullness of it so completely that she had to stop her horse for a moment. Henry pulled up beside her, reading her face the way he had learned to read her face over 5 years of marriage, and his expression was quiet and attentive. "All right," he said. "More than," she said. He looked out over the view, over the sweep of the territory in its autumn colors, and then back at her, and his face had the open, warm expression that he gave no one else, and that she had come to understand as the truest version of him. "Good," he said simply. James had turned his pony around and was looking back at them with the pragmatic impatience of a 7-year-old who has a destination in mind. "Are we stopping?" he called. "Just a moment," his father called back, and James accepted this with a sigh that was entirely his mother's and turned the pony back toward the ridge. Clara, from her position beside Henry, looked between her parents with the bright, comprehensive attention of a 5-year-old who understands more than she is supposed to and is privately pleased about it. And then she kicked Biscuit gently into motion and went after her brother, her braid bouncing and the laugh trailing back toward them on the clear October air. Henry and Alma sat their horses side by side and looked at the landscape and the children moving through it, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. And then they rode forward together into the rest of the morning. She still had the letter. Not in her pocket or her boot any longer, not somewhere she needed to carry it, but in the small box on the shelf in their bedroom where she kept the things that mattered most: a lock of her mother's hair, and a button from her father's coat, and a drawing James had made of the ranch when he was 4, and the pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet, and the letter in Dr. Hale's hand on good Cincinnati paper, with the wax seal intact. She took it out sometimes, not often, and read it not to remind herself of what she had been, but as a way of measuring the distance traveled, the distance from the woman who had arrived at the stagecoach stop in Salvation Creek with $30 and a letter that nobody believed, to all of this. The life and the work and the man and the children and the territory that had become hers in every way that mattered. Henry found her with it once, sitting at the bedroom window in the early morning before the household was awake, the letter open on her lap. He came and sat beside her on the window seat and looked at the letter without touching it. "You know," he said, "I still have not read the whole thing." "It is a good letter," she said. "Dr. Hale wrote it very well." "I am sure," he said, "but everything it says I already knew." She looked at him. "You could not have known it. You had watched me for 20 minutes. 20 very informative minutes," he said, with the faint lift at the corner of his mouth that she loved. "You diagnosed a horse, talked to her like a person, and did not ask me whether I thought you knew what you were doing. That told me most of what I needed to know." "And the rest," she said. "The rest," he said, "I learned afterward, to my very considerable satisfaction." She folded the letter and held it for a moment, looking out the window at the ranch in the early light, the mountains quiet on the horizon, the desert breathing its cool morning breath, the life they had made together entirely visible and entirely real in every direction. "It was enough," she said. "The $30 and the letter." "It was more than enough," he said. "It brought you here." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the window seat of their house on the Dalton Ranch in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1887. And outside, the morning was coming in over the mountains in long gold waves, and somewhere in the house James was waking up with the particular thumping energy of a boy who has remembered something interesting to do, and Clara would be awake in minutes if she was not already. And the day was about to begin with all its fullness and noise and purpose and love. Alma Abbott Dalton put the letter back in the box and closed the lid, and she turned to her husband, and the morning came.